The structural history of the Roman military concerns the major transformations in the organization and constitution of ancient Rome's armed forces. The most effective and long-lived military institution known to history, from its origins around 800 BC to its final dissolution in AD 476 with the demise of the Western Roman Empire. Rome's military organization underwent substantial structural change. At the highest level of structure, the forces were split into the Roman army and the Roman navy. Although these two branches were less distinct than in many modern national defense forces, within the top levels of both army and navy, structural changes occurred as a result of both positive military reform and organic structural evolution. These changes can be divided into four distinct phases. Phase 1. The army was derived from obligatory annual military service levied on the citizenry, as part of their duty to the state. During this period, the Roman army would wage seasonal campaigns against largely local adversaries. Phase 2. As the extent of the territories falling under Roman control expanded and the size of the forces increased, the soldiery gradually became salaried professionals. As a consequence, military service at the lower levels became progressively longer term. Roman military units of the period were largely homogeneous and highly regulated. The army consisted of units of citizen infantry known as legions as well as non-legionary allied troops known as auxilia. The latter were most commonly called upon to provide light infantry, logistical, or cavalry support. Phase 3. At the height of the Roman Empire's power, forces were tasked with manning and securing the borders of the vast provinces which had been brought under Roman control. Serious strategic threats were less common in this period and emphasis was placed on preserving gained territory. The army underwent changes in response to these new needs and became more dependent on fixed garrisons than on march camps and continuous field operations. Phase 4. As Rome began to struggle to keep control over its sprawling territories, military service continued to be salaried and professional for Rome's regular troops. However, the trend of employing allied or mercenary elements was expanded to such an extent that these troops came to represent a substantial proportion of the armed forces. At the same time, the uniformity of structure found in Rome's earlier military disappeared. Soldiery of the era ranged from lightly armed mounted archers to heavy infantry, in regiments of varying size and quality. This was accompanied by a trend in the late empire of an increasing predominance of cavalry rather than infantry troops, as well as a requirement for more mobile operations. Tribal forces. According to the historians Levy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing at a far later date, the earliest Roman army existed in the 8th century BC. During this period Rome itself was probably little more than fortified hilltop settlement and its army a relatively small force, whose activities were limited, mainly, to raiding and cattle rustling with the occasional skirmish-like battle. Historian Theodore Mommsen referred to it as Rome's Curiate Army, named for its presumed subdivision along the boundaries of Rome's three founding tribes, the Ramnians, Tities and Luceris. This army's exact structure is not known, but it is probable that it loosely resembled a warrior band or group of bodyguards led by a chieftain or king. Mommsen believes that Roman military organization of this period was regimented by the laws of the apocryphal King V. Italus, but these laws, though referred to by Aristotle, have been lost. The army consisted, according to Levy, of exactly 3,000 infantry and 300 horsemen, one-third from each of Rome's three founding tribes. Warriors served under 6 leaders of division, who in turn served under a general, usually in the person of the reigning king. Mommsen uses philological arguments and references from Levy and others to suggest that the greater mass of foot soldiers probably consisted of pilumni, with a smaller number possibly serving as archetes. The cavalry was far smaller in number and probably consisted solely of the town's richest citizens. The army may also have contained the earliest form of chariots, hinted at by references to the Flexentis. By the beginning of the 7th century BC, the Iron Age Etruscan civilization was dominant in the region. Like most of the other peoples in the region, the Romans warred against the Etruscans. By the close of the century, the Romans had lost their struggle for independence, and the Etruscans had conquered Rome, establishing a military dictatorship, or kingdom, in the city. Etruscan model hoplites. Although several Roman sources including Levy and Polybius talk extensively about the Roman army of the Roman kingdom period that followed the Etruscan capture of the city, no contemporary accounts survive. Polybius, for example, was writing some 300 years after the events in question, and Livy some 500 years later. Additionally, what records were kept by the Romans at this time were later destroyed when the city was sacked. The sources for this period cannot therefore be seen as reliable, as they can be for later military history, e.g., from the First Punic War onwards. According to our surviving narratives, the three kings of Rome during the Etruscan occupation were Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus. During this period the army underwent a reformation into a centurial army based on socio-economic class. This reformation is traditionally attributed to Servius Tullius, the second of the Etruscan kings. Tullius had earlier carried out the first Roman census of all citizens. Livy tells us that Tullius reformed the army by transplanting onto it the structure derived originally for civil life as a result of this census. At all levels, military service was, at this time, considered to be a civic responsibility and a way of advancing one's status within society. However, Rome's social classes were qualified rather than created by the census. It is perhaps more accurate to say therefore that the army's structure was slightly refined during this period rather than radically reformed. Prior to these reforms, the infantry was divided into the classes of rich citizens and the infraclassum of poorer citizens. The latter were excluded from the regular line of battle on the basis that their equipment was of poor quality. During the reforms, this crude division of poorer and richer citizens was further stratified. The army thereafter consisted of a number of troop types based upon the social class of propertied citizens, collectively known as adsidui. From the poorest in their fifth class, to the richest in their first class, and the equestrians above them, military service was compulsory for all. However, Roman citizens at this time generally viewed military service as a proper undertaking of duty to the state, in contrast to later views of military service as an unwelcome and unpleasant burden. Whereas there are accounts of Romans in the late empire mutilating their own bodies in order to exempt themselves from military service, there seems to have been no such reluctance to serve in the military of early Rome. This may in part be due to the generally lower intensity of conflict in this era, to the fact that men were fighting close to and often in protection of their own homes, or due to, as posited by later Roman writers, a greater martial spirit in antiquity. The equestrians, the highest social class of all, served in mounted units known as equites. The first class of the richest citizens served as heavy infantry with swords and long spears, and provided the first line of the battle formation. The second class were armed similarly to the first class, but without a breastplate for protection, and with an oblong rather than a round shield. The second class stood immediately behind the first class when the army was drawn up in battle formation. The third and fourth classes were more lightly armed and carried a thrusting spear and javelins. The third class stood behind the second class in battle formation, normally providing javelin support. The poorest of the propertied men of the city comprised the fifth class. They were generally too poor to afford much equipment at all and were armed as skirmishers with slings and stones. They were deployed in escreen in front of the main army, covering its approach and masking its maneuvers. Men without property, who were thereby excluded from the qualifying social classes of the adsidui, were exempted from military service on the grounds that they were too poor to provide themselves with any arms whatsoever. However, in the most pressing circumstances, even these proletarii were pressed into service, though their military worth was probably questionable. Troops in all of these classes would fight together on the battlefield, with the exception of the most senior troops, who were expected to guard the city. The army is said to have increased from 3,000 to 4,000 men in the 5th century BC, and then again from 4,000 to 6,000 men sometime before 400 BC. This later army of 6,000 men were then divided into 60 centuries of 100 men each. According to historian P. Fraccaro's hypothesis, when the Roman monarchy was replaced by two praetors in c. 500 BC, the royal legion was divided into two, each legion comprising 3,000 hoplites. The velites and cavalry were also split equally, for a total of 4,500 men. This remained the normal size of a republican legion until the end of the Social War. However, Levy states that a legion at the time of Marcus Furius Camillus consisted of only 3,000 infantry and 300 cavalry. Manipular Legion. The army of the early republic continued to evolve, and although there was a tendency among Romans to attribute such changes to great reformers, it is more likely that changes were the product of slow evolution rather than singular and deliberate policy of reform. During this period, an army formation of around 5,000 men was known as a legion. However, in contrast to later legionary formations of exclusively heavy infantry, the legions of the early and Middle Republic consisted of both light and heavy infantry. The term Manipular Army, an army based on units called maniples, is therefore used to contrast the later legionary army of the empire that was based around a system of cohort units. The Manipular Army was based partially upon social class and partially upon age and military experience. It therefore represents a theoretical compromise between the earlier class-based army and the class-free armies of later years. In practice, even slaves were at one time pressed into the army of the Republic out of necessity. Normally a single legion was raised each year, but in 366 BC 2 legions were raised in a single year for the first time. The Manipular Army got its name from the manner in which its heavy infantry was deployed. Maniples were units of 120 men each drawn from a single infantry class. The maniples were small enough to permit tactical movement of individual infantry units on the battlefield within the framework of the greater army. The maniples were typically deployed into three discrete lines based on the three heavy infantry types of Hostetter, Principes and Triarii. The first type, the Hostetter, typically formed the first rank in battle formation. They typically wore a mail shirt and brass helmet adorned with three feathers approximately 30 centimeters in height and carried an iron-bossed wooden shield, 120 centimeters tall and a slightly convex oval in shape. Traditionally they were armed with a sword known as a gladius and two throwing spears known as pila, one the heavy pilum of popular imagination and one a slender javelin. However, the exact introduction of the gladius and the replacement of the spear with the sword as the primary weapon of the Roman legions is uncertain, and it's possible that the early Manipular legions still fought with the Hostetter and Principes wielding the aster or spear. The second type, the Principes, typically formed the second rank of soldiers back from the front of a battle line. They were heavy infantry soldiers armed and armored as per the Hostetter. The Triarii, who typically formed the third rank when the army was arrayed for battle, were the last remnant of hoplite-style troops in the Roman army. They were armed and armored as per the Principes, with the exception that they carried a pike rather than two pila. A Triarii maniple was divided into two formations, each 6 men across by 10 men deep. A Manipular legion typically contained 1,200 Hostetter, 1,200 Principes and 600 Triarii. The three classes of unit may have retained some slight parallel to social divisions within Roman society. but at least officially the three lines were based upon age and experience rather than social class. Young, unproven men would serve as Hostetter, older men with some military experience as Principes, and veteran troops of advanced age and experience as Triarii. The heavy infantry of the Maniples were supported by a number of light infantry and cavalry troops, typically 300 horsemen per Manipular Legion. The cavalry was drawn primarily from the richest class of equestrians, but additional cavalry and light infantry were drawn at times from the Socii and Latini of the Italian mainland. The equites were still drawn from the wealthier classes in Roman society. There was an additional class of troops who followed the army without specific martial roles and were deployed to the rear of the Triarii. Their role in accompanying the army was primarily to supply any vacancies that might occur in the Maniples, but they also seem to have acted occasionally as orderlies to the officers. The light infantry of 1,200 velites consisted of unarmored skirmishing troops drawn from the youngest and lower social classes. They were armed with a sword and buckler diameter, as well as several light javelins, each with a 90 cm wooden shaft the diameter of a finger, with a 25 cm narrow metal point. Their numbers were swollen by the addition of allied light infantry and or regular aurarii. The Roman levy of 403 BC was the first to be requested to campaign for longer than a single season, and from this point on such a practice became gradually more common, if still not typical. A small navy had operated at a fairly low level after the Second Samnite War, but it was massively upgraded during this period, expanding from a few primarily river and coastal-based patrol craft to a full maritime unit. After a period of frenetic construction, the navy mushroomed to a size of more than 400 ships on the Carthaginian pattern. Once completed, it could accommodate up to 100,000 sailors and embark troops for battle. The navy thereafter declined in size. This was partially because a pacified Roman Mediterranean called for little naval policing, and partially because the Romans chose to rely during this period on ships provided by Greek cities, whose peoples had greater maritime experience. Proletarianization of the infantry. The extraordinary demands of the Punic Wars, in addition to a shortage of manpower, exposed the tactical weaknesses of the Manipular Legion, at least in the short term. In 217 BC, Rome was forced to effectively ignore its long-standing principle that its soldiers must be both citizens and property owners when slaves were pressed into naval service. Around 213 BC, the property requirement was reduced from 11,000 to 4,000 asses. Since the Romans are unlikely to have preferred to employ slaves over poor citizens in their armies, it must be assumed that, at this point, the proletarii of the poorest citizens must also have been pressed into service despite their lack of legal qualification. By 123 BC, the financial requirement for military service was slashed again from 4,000 asses to just 1,500 asses. By this time, therefore, it is clear that many of the property-less former proletarii had been nominally admitted into the assiduii. During the 2nd century BC, Roman territory saw an overall decline in population, partially due to the huge losses incurred during various wars. This was accompanied by severe social stresses and the greater collapse of the middle classes into lower classes of the census and the proletarii. As a result, both the Roman society and its military became increasingly proletarianized. The Roman state was forced to arm its soldiers at the expense of the state, since many of the soldiers who made up its lower classes were now impoverished proletarii in all but name, and were too poor to afford their own equipment. The distinction between the heavy infantry types of Hostetter, Principes and Triarii began to blur, perhaps because the state was now assuming the responsibility of providing standard-issue equipment to all but the first class of troops, who alone were able to afford their own equipment. By the time of Polybius, the Triarii or their successors still represented a distinct heavy infantry type armed with a unique style of cuirass, but the Hostetter and Principes had become indistinguishable. In addition, the shortage of available manpower led to a greater burden being placed upon its allies for the provision of allied troops, where accepted allies could not provide the required force types. The Romans were not averse during this period to hiring mercenaries to fight alongside the legions.